Hello everyone, thank you for joining us first thing on a Monday, what we hope will be an interesting and insightful start to the week. I'm Hannah Miller, political correspondent at ITV Granada, the Northwest Regional Programme. Previously I worked over in Yorkshire, so I've got plenty of experience trying to get east-west across the north. We're joined today by the Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, Lord Jim O'Neill, one of the most long-standing advocates of the Northern Powerhouse, and Sarah Longlands, Director of IPPR North. First thing to say, Lord O'Neill needs to leave from this a little bit early. So if you're still here with us at the end, which we hope you are, when he disappears, please don't think that he's just given up. But we've got plenty of things to discuss before then. How to build back better, build back greener, build back faster, to use the phrase of the government. What are the priorities for the north of England now, both for transport and also more widely? We're going to talk a little bit about productivity. It's much lower in the UK compared to other comparable countries. Why is that the case? How can it be improved? And is what we're seeing in the north really unique to our part of the country? What role does devolution have in improving things for people living in the north? We've had questions submitted. You can add your comments in the chat as we go along. But first of all, I'm going to give everyone here 5 minutes to set out their thoughts and introduce themselves. We'll start with Andy Burnham, who needs no introduction really, save to say that he was talking about Build Back Better before Boris Johnson was last week. Andy, over to you. Andy's still on mute.
There we go. It's the phrase of 2020. You're on mute. I have to say, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you. And morning, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. Before we come on to talk about the positive things we can do in the future, hopefully for the north, and all of the ambitions that we've got, I think you have to start with a tougher question, and that is, why have we been hardest hit by the virus? Because I think unless you start there and understand that, I'm not sure you can build back stronger or better. So I would say the reason why we've seen more cases, sadly more deaths, is linked to a fundamental lack of resilience in northern communities and indeed the northern economy. The reality is there are millions of people in the north on low-paid, insecure jobs. And I have heard it sort of played back to me repeatedly through this, that people were in work through lockdown, actually, many people, and they didn't stop. And they were in jobs where if they felt they were symptomatic, they still couldn't stop work because their work wouldn't allow them to do that. It doesn't permit them, if you like, to look after their own health. And we hear today, and it's not just the north, of course, the Midlands, and we hear today about the garment industry in Leicester, and that brings over the point I think that I'm making. So I think, Hannah, you have to start with that as a sort of fundamental issue here around the quality of work, and then you've got to link that to the poor quality of housing in many communities, because people were working in environments that were possibly not observing all the protocols, going home to kind of housing where perhaps there were kind of 2 or 3 generations living in the same house, and there you see the conditions in which the north gets hit harder by the virus. So I'm going to make 3 points this morning, but I'm going to start with this point. We need to strengthen the foundations, the foundational economy. We need to improve work. We've all been sort of on kind of conferences like this while other people have been out at work, and we've been calling them the essential workers. But their pay and their conditions wouldn't reflect that, because they're paid in a very, as I say, insecure, low value way. So I would say start there. Certainly a real living wage for everybody, a minimum of a £10 minimum living wage. But I would go beyond that and get rid of this casual culture in the workplace, the 0 hours contracts, even think of a universal basic income. Because actually, if you think about it, we've got to be resilient for the next pandemic, because there could be another pandemic next year. Just because we're having one now doesn't mean we won't have one in the future. We've got to learn the lessons of this and build more resilience in northern communities. What can I do about that? Well, I am looking at linking the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, which does advocate a real living wage and eradication of the casualisation we see in the workplace. We're thinking of linking that to all public procurement. And we think that sets a really clear message about build back better, improve people's jobs, and therefore improve people's health and their resilience and the resilience of communities. That's the first point, Hannah. The second point I would say is, if you're going to lay the conditions then further for a productive economy, as you said, we've got to accelerate the reform of public transport in this moment. So we've got an unprecedented opportunity here where the state is subsidising transport outside of London at a scale it's never done before in our lifetimes, and it's subsidising not just railways but bus and light rail. This is a moment where we can create London-style integrated, affordable, reliable public transport in the cities outside of London. And actually what I would do is link it very much to the clean air agenda. So as a stimulus to the economy, we help people switch their vehicles, but we also help bus companies switch to electric vehicles. We bring these two things together, and we see a huge acceleration of the reform of public transport towards that integrated system with a cap on what people can spend. The cost of public transport holds back the northern economy. If you were to travel on Metrolink, bus and train in any given day, you can spend easily over £20. That doesn't happen in London. The public transport system in London supports a productive economy and opens up opportunity to people to travel. We don't have that in the north. And sadly, the car is still king in the north because it's often cheaper, more reliable for people to get around. We have to change that. And so I would say take this moment to accelerate the reform of public transport. Then lastly, Hannah, third point, take this moment too to bring on the industries of the future, on those foundations of better work for everybody, reformed public transport. Let's start now actively intervening to build the green economy in particular. I think one of the effects of COVID will be an acceleration of progress towards zero carbon ambitions. And I think that will happen nationally and internationally. But I want to see it here, and it will require giving funding to areas like Greater Manchester to invest itself and become an investor in those industries of the future to get them going. So there's an obvious one, isn't there, which is the retrofitting of properties to make them zero carbon. There are thousands of jobs to be had there. It has to be done before 2050, 2038 in our case. Let's get on and do it now. And actually, it's going to be public-private, I think. Let's think about investing in new industries in that way. But also in Greater Manchester, we've got the potential for vaccine manufacturing, which we're looking at in South Manchester. And in the north, we're looking at a advanced manufacturing centre of excellence. So, this is the moment, I think, to get on with those, building those industries of the future, but crucially doing it on the foundations that I've mentioned before. So, Hannah, that's probably my 5 minutes, I think. I hope that gets the conversation going on a Monday morning, and I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Andy. Plenty to pick up on there for the next hour or so, I'm sure. We'll turn next to Jim O'Neill, who has talked for a long time, as I say, about the Northern Powerhouse now levelling up. What do you say in response to Andy, but also sort of your agenda moving forward?
Thank you, Hannah. It's a pleasure to be here. I really like what Andy said. I agree with so much of what Andy is prioritising. Let me follow it by making, actually I've got 7 things I want to say, but all pretty quick, you'd be pleased to know, so it should be less than 5 minutes. The first one of which, I was chatting to Andy about this a few weeks back, linked to my historical past. I've been involved in creating indices about long-term sustainable economic growth and development. And if you look at these kind of indicators and how this country has done in the pandemic, actually the British disappointing performance is not actually that surprising, and it's a reflection of something you said, Hannah, at the start. It's our weak productivity performance. And in many of the areas where, as discussed in the media every other day, where we have been so disappointing, I think it greatly reflects some of the weaknesses that the UK scores on some of these indicators, notably technology or the use of technology. as well as aspects of education and skills. And in the spirit of never letting a crisis go to waste, my own slight reprioritization of things reflect on that. Again, having gone through far too many crises in my professional life, the key thing is how one responds objectively to what you observe during a crisis. So the second thing to say in that regard, I actually think making sure the whole of the North's people, whatever 15 million or whatever it is, have proper access to all the best modern technologies there are. If you look at somewhere like a South Korea, on an index like I just mentioned, South Korea for best part of the past 20 years, one of the top scoring countries. And one of the reasons is because it ensures that all the greatest technologies are actually available to most of South Korea's people. And that is not the case in this country, and it's partly why we've made such a shambles of this mess. So rolling out more technology and allowing, Andy touched on it in terms of the more privileged of us communicating like this all day, every day, but a lot of other people just not in the slightest position to do things like that, and that needs to be prioritised more. Thirdly, linked to it, and strongly agree with what Andy said about housing. Here's an opportunity to have a complete step change thinking in issues to do with housing, particularly social housing. But I'd also prioritise education and skills even more than, if possible, than I did before. Of the things I often say, 6 necessities to deliver the success of Northern Powerhouse. Separately, education and skills are 2 of the 6. But in my view, the importance of those has risen as a result of this crisis, and particularly initiatives for areas of disadvantage, more, better, longer committed so-called opportunity areas, and more specific measures to help those in disadvantage. Fourthly, linked to Andy's role in life every day, I think if there was any vague doubts about the importance of devolution, it should be stepped up even more. So further progress in encouraging areas of the North that haven't had any, and lots more things linked possibly to the previous 2 points I've made, devolving greater powers to Greater Manchester and many other parts of the North. Fifthly, again touching partially to something Andy said about Build Back Cleaner, as I've been trying to campaign through various outlets, particularly a lot of the media, I think the case for the government to be a provider of what is known in finance as patient capital, and actually backing investments in the assets of the North. So alternative energies, life sciences, and advanced manufacturing should be at the part of this much talked about and never seemingly ever delivered levelling up approach on policy to the Northern Powerhouse. And the role of the government in that, I think, is almost obvious given the position they are in. Sixthly, we need this also much promised Green Book that is supposedly going to open the promised land to how we account for investments in infrastructure going forward to actually happen. It's almost been a year in the making, and I hope if it doesn't come with the Chancellor's announcements this week, it will come soon after. And then lastly, especially given it's the transport host of this event, I do believe that it seems to have been lost because it happened close to before this pandemic, but the sort of proposals to HS2 and what comes from it, HS North, is a surprisingly well thought out approach for this government. And they need to get on with all of that, as well as I can see in the chat going on, the greater prioritisation of things to do with transport within areas as well. And I'll stop there for now.
Thanks very much, Jim. There was plenty of nodding going on there, I could see from Sarah and Andy, particularly on the topic of more devolution, which I know is something that Sarah has talked about an awful lot in the past. So we'll come to you for your 5 minutes now, Sarah Longlands, read plenty of your State of the North reports. What should the state of the North be moving forward?
Thanks, Hannah, and thanks for the invitation to join this morning. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm from the Institute of Public Policy Research in the North, IPPR North. We're normally based in Manchester and in Newcastle, and we've been doing research on the north of England for the last 16 years. And for us, the question about how do we build back better is really framed by three questions, which I think really give us a chance to pause and reflect on what has been working well prior to COVID-19 and what we need to change. And the first question is about who might benefit from any future agenda, any future economic boost that the North may, and indeed the rest of the country may receive. Because as Andy was saying, 1 in 4 Northerners are paid less than the real living wage. And if you break that down to women, it's 1 in 3 paid less than the real living wage. And that's not really good enough in today's society, and it doesn't really bode well in terms of giving people a good quality of life and a chance to give their children a better future than they themselves once perhaps had themselves when they were growing up. So I think that's the first question about who will actually benefit. The second question is about how will we measure success, whether we call it levelling up or Northern Powerhouse. What will be the indices of success? And Jim talked about productivity, and we know that that's a serious issue for the north of England, but it's also quite an abstract term as well for people to get their head around. It's really kind of the miles per gallon of your economy. And so I think we also need to look at other measures of success, and we need to think about well-being, about the quality of health. And we know that the north has got some of the most serious health inequalities in the country, and that's part of the reason as to why we've been so badly hit by COVID-19. And we need to get to grips with that, because we can't hope to have a successful economy if we don't have an underlying good health of our population. And I think in that too, this crisis has really shone a light on how important education is. And Jim mentioned that as well. Our education is really fundamental to both getting ourselves out of this crisis and about educating ourselves out of COVID-19, but also in terms of our future economic potential. So I think those two things for me are really important in terms of measuring who's going to benefit and what success will actually look like if we manage to build back better. Then the third question is about who will get a say. And I think at the minute we've got a crisis which has really shown the deep divide between centre and local, and the real kind of misunderstanding at the centre about how things operate at a local level. And this sort of weird arrogance that you can pull a lever in Westminster and expect to get the same result everywhere. And I think this has really shown that we need now to change this, and we need to really get a grip on devolution. What we've got at the minute is really proper devolution. It's a bit of delegation, it's a bit of decentralisation, but it doesn't really give people like Andy the power they need to make the change for the future that will benefit the people in their area. So we need a proper system of devolution in which the rules of the game are clear, and that actually ramp up in terms of powers and resources to areas like Greater Manchester in the future. And then there's three kind of areas that I think those questions need to focus on. First of all is about levelling up on priorities. For too long, we focused on the economy in quite an abstract way. And I think now we need to think about the building blocks of that economy. And that means the next crisis that might be around the corner in terms of climate change. How do we ensure that the foundations of our economy in terms of our environmental assets and resources are properly safeguarded for the future? The North is particularly rich when it comes to nature. We've got 88% of all the peatlands in the UK. We've got 31% of all the water bodies. We've got a third of renewable energy generated in the north of England, and it's time to build on those foundations to really help the North grow in a sustainable way going forward. So levelling up on priorities, I think, is a crucial one. Second, about levelling up on power, as I've already mentioned, and Andy and Jim have already said as well, making sure that the areas like the North, like Greater Manchester, like our towns and cities have the powers they need to be able to really devolve their own mindset from that in Westminster. And because those people know much better than Westminster as to what will help those areas to move forward in the future. And then thirdly, we need a levelling up in terms of the finances and investment. We IPPR North have written extensively about how the dice is already loaded against the North in terms of how the finances are worked out. places like London and the South East get twice as much investment in public transport as we do in the North. And in some parts of the North, it's a quarter of the investment they get in London and the North East, like the North East and Yorkshire and Humber. So there's a real kind of divergence in terms of the investment that the North receives. And that links into Jim's point about Green Book and how that has also really worked against the North's interests. But also, it's not just about the money, it's also about the capacity to develop schemes. I mean, some questions have been raised about particular transport schemes in the North, and you can only develop those schemes, you can only bring them forward if you've got the people in the North to actually develop and build and plan them. And at the minute, we're very reliant on Westminster to do that for us, and that they might not necessarily be interested in doing that on our behalf. So I think building the capacity, leveling up in terms of resources, and making sure that we've got a proper sense of what it will take to actually turn the dial on regional inequalities in the longer term. So I think that's all from me. I think I've taken up my time, but really happy to engage further.
Thanks very much, Sarah. I think, seeing as we're sitting here on a Transport for the North webinar, it feels like it makes sense to start first of all with those kind of questions about infrastructure development, and lots of questions coming in on the chat and things about transport and how we facilitate that in the post-COVID era. It's interesting that all three of you have picked up a whole range of issues beyond just transport, which is of course what you were asked to do, don't get me wrong, but it feels so much wider than specifically transport. How important do you think the infrastructure development that we've talked about for a long time is for the economic recovery of the North moving forward? Where does transport sit in the level of priorities? Should we start with you, Jim?
Thank you. You know, I think a couple of things that candidly that involve some degree of contradiction. I mean, and again, having gone through a lot of crises, I know the pitfalls of thinking that something that you're thinking today as a result of the crisis might be permanent. But obviously, the specific nature of this health crisis and the social distancing angle would appear to be suggesting that quite a lot of office-based employers are actually thinking about permanent change. To some degree, and hence the contradiction, in many parts of the North, it's probably not as applicable as some other parts of the country, particularly London and the South East, where I think this is a huge challenge for London, if this turns out to be true, or central London. But if you did make the assumption that it is permanent, I think it does to me suggest that aspects of the transport infrastructure are not as important as some may have seen them relative to the other factors that I and the other two talked about going forward. And certainly, you know, I've been quite involved in another way with discussions to do with what kind of recovery we're going to get. And Bank of England Chief Economist Andy Haldane's comments Thursday about he looks more and more as though it's going to be actually a V-shaped recovery, which most people think is kind of impossible. But actually the indicators I look at, trends I look at, suggest right now that could be the case. But how on earth can that be real given everything we're talking about? And I think part of the answer means that there's a certain, privileged is the wrong phrase, but I'll use it. There's a certain section of our community, I describe myself as part of it, that can operate perfectly normally, professionally, despite this crisis. And that doesn't involve any form of physical transport. It's this. And it's why I talk about telecommunications and technology as being even more vital, and actually more vital than I realized before. But also why education and skills are just exceptionally important. So that's sort of, in a way, not what you asked me, but that's how I would answer it. On the transport, I think at the margin, it probably does mean within the relative priorities that I think many people on this call know, I believe, that getting around within the north is even more important relative to HS2 than it was before. If we're going to have tens of thousands of people not working as frequently from offices, that means that the numbers that we'll be getting from London to other places will be less than before. And the economics of that will be trickier. But in order to deliver what the Northern Powerhouse concept is all about, and for day-to-day life of so many people linked to this call, we do have to make dramatic improvements to train and bus systems within cities and between them in the north. And as Sarah touched on, this is to emphasise again why this much promised Green Book review is so vital in order that these things can be approved much more easily than they would have been before.
Thanks, Jim. Andy, we hear a lot from the government about shovel-ready schemes, as they like to call them, particularly with regard to transport. And we had Boris Johnson saying build, 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 is sort of putting quite an emphasis on transport infrastructure. For you, do you think that where would you put transport on the list of priorities now? And what, from your experience of going to government with schemes that are ready, what do they mean by shovel ready? What is the definition of shovel ready? Are you convinced that things happen once they are shovel ready or oven ready or whatever the phrase might be?
Really great questions, Hannah. I mean, to answer your first one, where does transport sit? I can only give you the experience of being the first mayor of Greater Manchester for the last 3 years, and it has to be top. I mean, it's what most people contact me about every single day. They're frustrated, the unreliability of it, the fragmented nature of it, the cost of it. It doesn't work and it's holding us back. And I absolutely get what Jim's saying. I think the transport debate is going to be changed by COVID, as everything is. But I personally don't think that's going away. And I do think Jim's right. It kind of brings intra-city, city regional transport more to the fore, as opposed to intercity, which is obviously the big debate about HS2. I think that the point you make about infrastructure, Hannah, this is a little frustration for me. Transport is becoming synonymous with infrastructure in the sort of public debate about it. It's like it's only about big infrastructure into the future. Now, that is critical, don't get me wrong. But most people's experience is the everyday, and transport needs to be more about how you make quick improvements to the way transport is organised and integrated on a basic day-to-day level. And that's where my focus is. You know, if you were to ask me, if I was to say what's my top ask of the government, it's the funding and the powers to create a London-style public transport system in Greater Manchester. That is what I most want. And actually, I think it is more important now, because as Jim says, you know, people may go to the office less, they may go to the city centre less, but they're probably going to be shuttling from where they live to the city and back. And, you know, that I think is going to how people are going to want to live and work. They probably want to work more flexibly now. Maybe, you know, start and end times to the working day might change. And public transport's got to be there to support that type of change. I mean, I'm looking at the towns of Greater Manchester and worrying about the impact on the high street. Therefore, this is a moment to kind of rethink those towns, replace the redundant retail with modern, zero carbon, high quality, affordable residential that's close to public transport. So start building for public transport rather than building for the car, and revitalise those towns using the model we've got in Stockport with the Stockport Mayoral Development Corporation. Let's have a lot more of that. Then just to answer your point about shovel ready, and I do get a bit frustrated with this phrase like you, it's kind of implicit in your question. In this recent funding round that we got last week, and we got £54 million for shovel ready projects, explicitly it meant delivered by March 2022. That's what it meant. So if you couldn't demonstrate that your project was going to be built by then, you didn't get the funding. But that kind of slims it down to a very, very small list of projects. So the big things that we have aspirations around, platforms 15 and 16 at Piccadilly and the improvements to the Castlefield corridor, knocked out by that. We got instead a £10 million development sort of fund for that. So my answer to this always, Hannah, will be, please, yes, we need to talk about infrastructure, and it creates a vision for the North in 2030 or 2040. You can imagine HS2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail coming through Manchester Piccadilly. I do think that Piccadilly would become the heart of the Northern Powerhouse, that area around it. It would be like the Canary Wharf of the North, I would think. Highly attractive place to invest. But that's a vision for the long term. Let's fix what is happening now on the ground, day to day in Greater Manchester. Let's make it much more affordable for people, and therefore make public transport preferable to the car. And until we fix that, I think we really aren't going to be kind of heading in the right direction. And while Jim might be right about people's demand for public transport is going to diminish, I'm looking at a year, 18 months where we've got severely constrained capacity on public transport, and just making it work in the next couple of years is going to be a struggle. But let's use this moment, as I say, to kind of rethink how this thing works and bring on the change that the cities outside of London have waited far too long for.
Thanks, Andy. Sarah, you talked before about thinking all the time about who benefits from the work that we do in the North. When you hear the government talking about the sort of quick wins, does that potentially create the opportunity to start on projects that actually do make quite a sort of quick difference to people's lives, whether that's, going into town or between, buses, light rail, that kind of thing? Do you see the focus moving that way? And do you think that's helpful in terms of your sense of who benefits?
I think, the point about the oven ready and quick wins, at the minute we are dealing with a government where it's all about the soundbite. It's not necessarily about the detail of the policy. It's about the how many sound bites and pieces of rhetoric can you get out in any one speech. So, and I find that frustrating because I think it sort of detracts from what we're trying to achieve here. I think in terms of your question, I think there are things that government can do, and obviously there was a big speech last week, the Build speech, which, to be honest, was a lot of announcements that we'd already heard before, was very much a reheating of existing commitments. And whilst I think that those types of schemes can actually help to achieve good quality jobs and all the rest of it, you have to do more than just simply put the money in place. You have to make sure that public money works hard. And it's like Andy said, you've got to make sure that if public money is being used to build, whether it's housing or bridges or new transport schemes, you have to make sure that those jobs are actually good quality jobs, giving people a decent wage, giving them decent terms of condition, and are actually making sure that the money that's been invested by the public sector is going back into people's pockets, because otherwise, what is the actual point? And I think my fear about the emphasis on the infrastructure as the kind of quick win, if you like, is that it won't be that quick really, because infrastructure takes a long time to plan, it takes a long time to implement, and there's also real challenges in terms of making sure that what we're talking about here is capital money. And it's about capital announcement. And the government obviously are keen to do capital projects because interest rates are low. But what we're really missing in all of these announcements is some actual money to actually build the pathways whereby people who are being laid off now can actually find their way into those new jobs. And that means revenue funding. That means employing people to support those people who've been made redundant, help to reskill them, help them to retrain them, and get them back into the workforce. And that kind of resource, that kind of funding, that kind of support, if you like, is really missing from the government's agenda at the minute, and we really need to address that. And I think no more so in terms of things like further education and higher education. They've got a key role to play in this, in recovering from this crisis. But we've heard nothing about what support might be made available for those institutions going forward. So I think and ready, quick. In this crisis, there's no magical solution to this crisis. There's no panacea, no matter what kind of rhetoric we hear. It's just back to, good old fashioned, decent education, decent skills support, decent wages, and helping people to try and find their way back. And I think any kind of pretense that there's some sort of magic solution to this is kind of really ill-founded at the current time. And it undermines just how serious this is and how many people are actually suffering at the moment as a result of this crisis. And we're only in the foothills of the crisis. We haven't even got to the worst of it. So that would be my thoughts on it.
Thanks very much. I want to move on to talk a little bit about the environment and sort of building a build back greener, to use the phrase, because it's something where we've had quite a few questions, people talking about the environment quite a bit coming up in the chat about it as well. And it's also something that all three of you in one way or another have picked up on. It does seem in some ways that throughout this, there's been a bit of a necessary contradiction, perhaps encouraging people off public transport, suggesting that the capacity isn't quite there for sort of social distancing on public transport, getting people into their cars where they perhaps feel safer. People moving around less has led to better air quality, but ultimately if they're now going to move into their cars, what does that do in the long run? Do you think that there is a case for, across the north, there being a kind of overarching green strategy? What can northern leaders do to push that kind of green agenda forward? I'll start with you, Jim.
Yeah.
Oh, Sarah, sorry. No, if you're ready, go for it.
I was just going to say, IPPR, we published a plan in beginning of June, earlier June just passed, in the middle of COVID, we published a plan for nature in the north, which basically set out our thoughts on the fact that we felt that nature should be a really core part of the recovery in the north of England, because the north is so rich when it comes to nature. Let's build on those strong foundations to actually help create new jobs, like, for example, what Andy mentioned in terms of decarbonisation, but also in ecosystem management. There are lots of potential opportunities to reclaim and redevelop our ecosystems, which have been really badly degraded in recent years. And research has shown that by doing that, you can actually create a massive return on investment as well. So I think that, and I think there's a real opportunity for North. We suggested in our paper that if northern leaders came together to agree a consensus and a way forward and a strategy for that, then that could really have a massive impact on our future recovery.
Jim, should we come to you?
A couple of things. The way you asked the question, there are huge contradictions inherent in what the government, on the rare days when there's something vaguely clear from what they're saying, on the rare days, there's actually often a contradiction, because and it's understandable, and this is partly why this is all so tricky coming out of this. But and I think we'll see this, is my guess, in the Chancellor's policies announced Wednesday, that there is this absolute prioritisation of saving every job. But actually, if you stand back from the past decade or longer, our bigger problem, we did have in January record employment, as it's described, of all time. And our real problem is productivity is weak. And by focusing properly on strategic priorities like net zero, we could come out of this mess actually doing something a bit more seriously about some of our productivity issues. And so it really should take huge priority. And the government makes quite a lot of noise about the environment and green policies in the north. But we really need to see, as with other things, some specific action and commitments, which I'm not sure we will get. I suspect this will be something that comes more later in the year with the more normal budget. I hope I'm wrong, but it's a huge, again, where I started from, in the spirit of not letting a crisis go to waste. This is a huge opportunity, given we have this peculiar situation where the government essentially presides over the ownership of vast swathes of the whole country's industry. They can have a mammoth influence on supporting or encouraging businesses that are only truly committed to net zero emissions. And the second part of answering that, it goes back to when I touched on about this investment fund. The North is one of the three things which the North has genuine world-class capabilities in. That vast parts of alternative energies in the UK are based in the North. And I really hope things like advanced modular reactors and various other natural assets of the North and its history can be put to enormous use here to make a strategic gameplay to the future of the country by using what the North has got. And let's pray that they're as focused on it as some of the rhetoric occasionally creeps out.
Andy, you mentioned before about retrofitting and things as a way of building back better. Are you confident that if we were to go ahead with schemes like that, that it would create the jobs in the North that you want to see, that we have the skills and the expertise to do things like that? You know, how do you feel about the whole green agenda moving forward?
Fascinating listening to Jim, and I know he's got some sway within the government, and I do hope they're listening to him still, because I think this is a moment to galvanise on the green economy. I really do, and we'd be making a big mistake if we didn't. But both from an opportunity point of view, Hannah, but also from a threat point of view. So the opportunity, you asked me, can we create jobs? Yes, because domestic properties need to be retrofitted. And that will require retraining a lot of people to do that kind of work. And, you know, I'm told in Greater Manchester, if we're to hit 2038, which is our ambition, it will need thousands of people, a workforce of thousands to do that work. So there is clearly an immediate job creation opportunity if you are to accelerate your zero carbon ambitions. But just let me turn to the threat. I'm not sure if it was Sarah, if it was IPPR or some other organisation, talked about the reskilling requirement of the green economy that's coming anyway, whether we accelerate or not. You know, obviously, you know, construction is going to change quite fundamentally. Building a passive house, as it's called, is a very different thing to traditional bricks and mortar building a house. The motor trade, as we go to, you know, hybrids and electric, it's a different skill set that you need to work in that. So there was a warning last week that if we don't retrain people, we're going to have an even bigger productivity problem, competitiveness problem, because we're going to have a lot of people whose skills are outdated, and the green economy will be moving quickly, and we won't be in a position to face up to it. So I think it's both, is what I would say, Hannah. But coming out of this, I just think there's, you know, things that we need to do as a country, i.e. solve public transport outside of London, tackle the housing crisis. But both of these things can be kind of linked together, if you like, and accelerated in the North. So let's commit to accelerate the retrofitting of domestic properties. Let's build a new generation of zero carbon social housing, as Jim was saying. Let's kind of clean up the air now and give bodies like the Greater Manchester Combined Authority funding to invest in electric buses that we can then kind of use to lease back to operators to begin the reform of public transport. You know, all of these agendas can come back together and can kind of be bound together by the zero carbon ambition. So yeah, and one last thing, I mean, Jim mentioned digital infrastructure. That should be part of our green vision as well. Proper, high quality, full fibre across the north of England, I think would support a more productive north, allowing more people to work from home, transacting more in digital ways. I mean, that too, I think, is part of the answer. And very lastly, Sarah's right. You know, empower us now with the funds and the ability to borrow to do these things. You know, Steve Rotherham's got a plan for a tidal barrier on the Mersey. It's an exciting project, and we would want to be a funder, a part of that, because the green energy that comes from it could go into the grid in Greater Manchester. So, you know, allow us to get on and sort of launch these big ambitions, these big projects. Because if not now, then when?
Thanks, and also thank you to everyone who's joining in on social media with the hashtag TFN Talks, particularly to the person who I think has downloaded Zoom specifically for today after several weeks, just to listen to you all. So there we go. We did have a question as well about involving young people in this moving forward. And making sure that the growth that we talk about is inclusive for young people. I guess to some extent that touches on some of the education issues that have already been raised. How can you make sure that young people are engaged with this, included in the way that we talk about it and think about it, and sort of part of the Northern agenda heading into the future? Who wants to start on that? Andy, go on.
Just because I've been doing quite a lot of work with our Youth Combined Authority through this, and we did a question time with young people a couple of weeks ago. We opened up to young people across Greater Manchester, and it was kind of amazing, really, just to hear their voices and slightly different perspectives on things. I've appointed Diane Medal, former athlete who runs her own charity. She's leading a young person's task force for us, because we recognise we've got to listen to their voices, and we can't assume what's needed. You know, I think this whole thing is going to be highly disruptive to young people's lives and their ambitions. I think many kind of paths have been many people have been derailed, haven't they, in this moment. And it's good to hear the government talking today about a scheme, but it was what, 30,000 placements or something. I can't, you know, not. It's what Lord Kerslake would call a pea shooter policy. You know, you need policies of scale, I think, if you're to not allow young people to be the major casualties of this and sort of have long-term scars that they will struggle to recover from. So, Hannah, what comes through when I speak to them is mental health support is a huge theme, and you know, something as, you know, we've just got to think differently about how we support them. The cost of travel is always a major thing. So I've just, as difficult as it is, I've just opened my free bus pass for 16 to 18s to new applications, and we're determined to preserve that. I think we're going to have to think differently about how we help them think of their own future. You know, it's often, we talk about apprenticeships and we talk about young people. Well, yeah, that's going to be right for some. We never talk to young people in the North about, how about you create your own business, or you create your own social enterprise? We never get given that message. It's almost like we assume that we're going to be employees in our, you know, Northern DNA rather than employers. So I kind of feel you've got to have a much more forward-looking sort of agenda for young people. Give them a range of options as to what they might do coming out of this. And I think it is about prioritising them for investment. We're talking of a young person's guarantee. So something for every young person in Greater Manchester to do this September. And I think it's got to be that immediate and that tangible. Otherwise, we will see a lot of young people falling through the net.
You know, to me, it's sort of I find my mind going around in circles listening to Andy and you asking that question. I mean, the success of the Northern Powerhouse is young people and the future. I mean, you know, there's always so much focus about the big fancy long-term infrastructure projects. They're only going to be relevant to people that are young today, certainly not to me, people of my generation. And so they should have a big say as to whether that is as important as other things. You know, Greta Thunberg is an inspirational, strategic game changer with the whole net zero movement. And we need that with the Northern Powerhouse. We need more young people wanting to drive this whole thing and take it up and influence. We saw how Greta Thunberg managed to drag more people out of the cabinet to one meeting with her than virtually anybody or anything in the past decade. And if we had that with young people in the North, it would be brilliant. So it's sort of obvious to me, I mean, as you know and others know, you know, I'm particularly passionate about all this stuff as it relates to education. I devote a large part of my time to as an educational philanthropist for people from disadvantage in the north. And this goes back to what I said at the start. You know, I've witnessed and experienced the remarkable improvements in educational attainment for disadvantaged people in parts of London the past 20 years. So it can happen. And if you look at that in the north today, there is huge parts of the north where the educational outcomes are just very poor. And what is always so interesting to me, the amount of money that's needed to change that is tiny compared to a lot of the big infrastructure projects. And this should be a huge, huge priority. Hence why I talk about more focused and a greater number of so-called opportunity areas, for example, and a whole array of initiatives that link to that.
I'll bring Sarah in on this in a second, but I'm aware, Jim, that you need to go fairly shortly. I just want to pick up, first of all, the government talked about its tuition that it's going to be doing kind of into the new year. The new school year, are you confident that that is enough to help those disadvantaged children that you work with so much? And finally as well, which will be a question to everyone, just to give the others some warning, but I'm not letting you off the hook by leaving early. If you had one ask of the Chancellor this week when he makes his statement, what would it be? So first of all, how do you feel about the tuition announcements that have been made? And then finally, what would your ask be?
So I think the tuition announcement was an urgent necessity, and I actually, the chair of the Education Select Committee, Rob Halfon, deserves a huge amount of congratulations for being so determined to push the government into that. And my own Northern Powerhouse partnership and others played a big, I'm sure IPPR and others played a huge role in all of this, and it's good, but it's not enough. What we really need, and it links to some of this talk about aspects of the government's supposed initiatives, we need the Prime Minister to instruct every single government department that is relevant for levelling up and delivering the long-term success of the Northern Powerhouse to be told to treat it as a priority. And that particularly includes the Department of Education. From my own experience, even under the government of Cameron and Osborne that brought the Northern Powerhouse into some kind of vague life, the Department of Education essentially ignored it. And Andy and his team have had to tussle with ever since they started. Even on things that are supposedly devolved, they don't get devolved unless you sort of completely physically drag it out of the place. And the Prime Minister, never mind the Chancellor, needs to tell them, you are going to be committed to whatever policies we decide on it. And I think on education, there's a lot more that needs to be done to treat it really seriously, because we can have whatever fancy new trains or buses as we would like, but unless we get more young people having the ability in the first place to get the right education and the aspiration to have the education, none of this stuff will matter. And so I've actually, in a way, already, the one thing I would really want to see is this Prime Minister stand, in this sort of American-style weird thing that happens in modern life where the leader speaks and there's all these people stood behind them. He has the heads of every department and he's saying, each of these people is now going to prioritise everything they need to do for the Northern Powerhouse. And that, I would like to see that.
Thanks very much, Jim. Sarah, I'll come to you. Obviously, you didn't have a chance to comment on the inclusive growth question earlier as well. So any thoughts that you have on that in terms of how we make sure that young people are engaged? And then also your thoughts on, if you could pick one thing and go and ask Rishi Sunak for it today, what would it be?
Yeah, okay, so on the young people point, I mean, IPPR just published some research at the weekend which showed that, over the next few months, something like 620,000 young people between the ages 18 and 24 are likely to be jobless, to lose their job or not be able to get a job in the next few months. So I mean, I think that's a really serious issue, obviously. And it really needs, as Jim was saying, a real priority on education and support, because lots of young people will be sitting at home now thinking, shall I go to university in September? Shall I try and defer? Shall I go back to college? Shall I try and get an apprenticeship? So I think that, we really need to address the seriousness of the situation in which we find ourselves. And I think there are lots of things that we could be doing in this space that were not being discussed so far. Like, for example, bringing together issues around high streets and digital, and making space available for young people in empty premises and in high streets to develop a new business, to develop a new idea, to get some support and training in a kind of safe, socially distanced way, and actually giving them the help they need to be able to start to build a new future for themselves. I think there's a real role here for small amounts of revenue funding, micro grants, the chance to enable young people to experiment and to explore what working and living in a socially distanced way and learning in a social distance way can do, because lots of universities and some of the colleges as well are doing lots of interesting things with the kind of conditions, the limiting conditions that we find ourselves in. So I think lots more experimentation, lots more small amounts of money, revenue funding to really help people and hold their hand through this process is what is needed. We can't afford to abandon young people at this time. We need to be with them, and we need to be supporting them along the journey, rather than relying on kind of abstract infrastructure schemes that we hope, rather than actively encourage to help those people in the future. And in terms of the other thing about young people is involving them. Why not we just commit to actually setting up a young people's panel for the whole of the North, where we choose 50, 60 young people at random, and we get them to sit down with the mayors and the leaders of the North to actually develop a programme for recovery, a programme for what a better North might look like. And that would help to inform the work of all the mayors across the North, but all the regional, all of the local authority leaders as well, and actually set out a real programme which is devised by them and that they feel actually part of. And I think that there's no reason why we couldn't be doing that work today. It's an approach that's worked really well in other parts of Europe and the world too, that kind of citizens assembly, crucially, authentically involving people in the conversation. And then finally, on what I would ask Rishi Sunak, there's lots of things we could ask Rishi Sunak for, but I would really plead with them to stabilise local government finance. Local government has a level of resilience which is really, really low at the minute because we've had 10 years of austerity. There's no extra capacity anywhere. And someone mentioned earlier about resilience, about robustness, and that ability to be able to absorb shocks is crucial if we're going to deal with COVID crises now and in the future, but also the environmental crises. So without that security of funding, without that capacity at the local level, we can't expect local government to keep taking these hits and simply respond in the way that it has. So I think crucially, stabilise local government funding and commit to doing all it takes to support local government through the next months and years as this crisis unfolds and hopefully comes to some resolution.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Andy, your thoughts on if you could have a chat with Boris Johnson and ask for one thing, what would it be this week?
Well, I agree very strongly on the point about council funding. Councils will be critical to recovery, Hannah, and if they've not got that long-term security about funding, they're getting things in dribs and drabs at the moment, and it's not really good enough in terms of the basis for recovery. But to go to the big point, I think, like I said on the Today programme with Andy Street, it's substantial, devolved funding for a whole range of meaningful interventions in the labour market. I mean, that's the immediate priority, let's be honest. We're going to see unemployment rising in the North, unfortunately. So that's the thing we need to address. But if I had my ideal world, as well as Jim's kind of lined up by the permanent secretaries behind, that would be great. But if he could say, this has got to be a moment for devolution. I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? I'm biased, but I think devolution is beginning to work. It's definitely rebalancing the political debate in our country, and IPPR played a big role in that, Sarah, and we're really grateful to you. But it is now. The debate about regional inequality is very live, and and Transport for the North actually has played its role in that. And I just need to say this, they helped us in the middle of the rail crisis speak with one clear voice. All of the North spoke with one clear voice. And I think we ended up bringing a measure of stability back to the railways in the North because we were able to do that. So, these structures, we're kind of making them work for the first time, but they are working. And I would say really make this a moment for devolution. Maybe my last point, Hannah, because I know you're kind of running up against the clock. look at this kind of response phase to the crisis. It's been highly centralised, and I would say not always particularly effective. You know, they've kind of created new systems outside of the local delivery that is already there on testing and on contact tracing, and so it's been a highly top-down thing, and it hasn't, I don't think, worked particularly well. And recovery absolutely cannot be led like that. It's got to be bottom-up driven. Otherwise, it really will not work, and it won't work for the North if it's all initiatives dumped on us and the usual Whitehall approach. So it's got to be a moment for devolution. You know, they've talked a big game about devolution. We're yet to see the kind of reality of what they're going to do. You know, if the Chancellor was to stand up and say, I'm making, well, here we are, I'll answer your question like this. I'm going to make £1 billion immediately available to Greater Manchester to ensure that we don't have a lost generation and huge unemployment. And this is just the first step in devolving control of all public spending to combined authorities so that you can, you know, rebalance the country, knowing what you know about your communities and what they need, because Sarah's absolutely right about that. We know them better than they do. So, yeah, £1 billion on Wednesday and full devolution of everything beyond. I'll settle for that, Hannah. Full devolution of everything.
I'll look forward to asking how you feel about that on Wednesday, Thursday later this week. Thank you both for joining us, and to Jim as well. We've had Andy, Sarah and Jim O'Neill. Please do continue to share this chat. The hashtag is TFN Talks. It will be available for people to watch afterwards as well. So everyone who missed out, you can tell them how great it was. I think we've heard some really interesting ideas, particularly Sarah's young people's panel is getting quite a lot of pickup on our chat here. We might have just created another job for ourselves. But yeah, for now, thank you very much for listening, everyone. And we look forward to continuing the debate.